Hi, I'm Luke Johnson. I'm the author of the Public Sphere newsletter, and welcome to this Substack Live. I'm joined by Mark Leon Goldberg, who's a veteran international affairs journalist and the author of the Global Dispatches Substack and Global Dispatches podcast, which you should definitely subscribe to. Today, we're talking about the efforts by U.S. President Donald Trump to create a so-called Board of Peace, which experts and critics say is an effort to create something of a runaround around the United Nations Security Council. It's part of Trump's efforts to recreate the 1945 post-1945 world order in his image. And it's gotten something of a cool reception among the other four permanent members of the Security Council. Russia, China, France, and the UK have not said they would join or have formally declined the invite. And Mark Carney, who gave a blockbuster speech about 2 weeks ago at Davos, or a week and a half ago, was the offer was rescinded by Trump in the aftermath of his speech. However, some countries from the Middle East, most importantly, and some other ones like Kazakhstan and Hungary have accepted the invite. So I'm pleased to welcome Mark to answer questions about this body and what it might do and how it might be influencing the Security Council. So welcome, Mark. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks. Well, first, thanks for having me, Luke. My name is Mark Leon Goldberg. As Luke said, I'm an international affairs journalist. I've been doing the Global Dispatches podcast twice a week, every week for the last 13 years. I interview people around the world about news and events that's happening in their part of the world, often with an eye towards undercovered global stories. I also got my start as a journalist covering the United Nations. I started a blog about the UN in the early 2000s, if you guys remember what blogs are, about the UN called UN Dispatch. And I currently have a separate podcast called To Save Us from Hell, which is a chat show about the United Nations. So happy to talk everything international affairs, United Nations, multilateralism. It's all in my wheelhouse.
Great. Well, thank you. So, Mark, this board started out as having the mandate to implement the Gaza ceasefire, which, I might add, the Gaza wars, people are still dying in Gaza. But it passed 13-0 in November at the UN Security Council with Russia and China abstaining. What was it meant to do in November?
So, I mean, it was meant and originally designed specifically to oversee the peace plan and peace process in Gaza. It did not initially have this global remit as has been rolled out by Donald Trump in recent weeks. Rather, it was very specifically intended as basically like a coalition of the willing to support Gaza's reconstruction with the United States at the top of that list. Um, the Board of Peace hasn't done much meaningful on Gaza. It seems to have now, have greater ambitions, and Gaza seems to be a peripheral issue for it, which is, concerning for one. But in terms of the benchmarks towards that Gaza ceasefire, that the Board of Peace was initially intended to spur on. There's been some limited progress towards those benchmarks, but to me, the big outstanding question on Gaza specifically is, as it always has been since the launch of this peace process, which is will Hamas disarm? To whom will Hamas disarm? The initial peace plan that was brokered at the Security Council, that was, supposedly to be overseen by this Board of Peace, envisioned an international security force to deploy to Gaza. That force is nowhere near to being deployed, as countries aren't sort of volunteering their soldiers to go in harm's way in Gaza. And, I would have thought that this Board of Peace would have created some political momentum towards the deployment of an actual stabilization force in Gaza, but it hasn't. Again, I think its focus has turned elsewhere.
Right. So why was this created to begin with? I mean, usually UN and various agencies in the UN deal with implementing ceasefires. Did they create this thing initially just to kind of placate Trump or get him on board?
I think get him on board and get the Israelis on board. Israel has had a really hostile relationship with the United Nations that's grown, worse by the day, even in the context of this like ceasefire and like lessening of hostilities in Gaza. Israel is still taking aggressive moves against the United Nations. It's kind of kicked out UNRWA, the UN agencies that's supposed to oversee the welfare and social welfare of Palestinians. It's basically expelled them from Israel itself. It's like raided their offices. So there's this kind of ongoing hostility and animus that Israel is directing against the United Nations, which I think is why Israel did not want to agree to a peace process that put the UN at the center of it. So they kind of created this,
Carve out,
separate.
basically.
Yeah,
Yeah.
separate entity. Not necessarily like a bad thing, if your goal
Sure,
here
sure.
is to, ultimately and urgently end this awful war in Gaza, kind of improvising is not necessarily a bad idea. But I don't see much follow through since.
Right,
Since then.
right, right. And it's, the war in Gaza has fallen off the international radar screen largely. But how has the Board of Peace changed to like what did it change into in Davos?
Like nothing. It really is a nothing. It didn't start as anything, and it hasn't merged to become anything in the meantime. Countries have ostensibly signed on board to join it, but it hasn't done anything. It hasn't met.
Right.
Countries that have joined seem to have done so transparently in order to curry favor with Donald Trump, and not as part of like some broader project to project peace or create like a new multilateral instrument to support peace efforts around the world. This is like a very much an opportunity for countries to get on Donald Trump's good sides for whatever parochial reasons they want to.
So the Guardian described it as a pay to play body. What are the fees for this organization?
There's been like mentions in the press that you got to like commit $1 billion, but no one really knows what that $1 billion is going towards. No one knows if actually any country has committed any money yet. This is not like a transparent thing. And
Hmm.
it again, it just seems to be, you know, like the roster of countries that have signed up for it are those that, are already kind of ideologically aligned with Donald Trump, like Hungary or Chile, or governments in the Middle East, in the Gulf in particular, that see this as another opportunity to advance their regional interests through currying favor with Donald Trump.
And many of those countries have financial interests with the Trump organization,
Yeah.
and various crypto businesses.
Mhm.
So what was the reaction to this among, the other P4, the other people who have veto power in the United Nations?
Well, I mean, no entity, no other member, veto wielding member of the Security Council has joined the Board of Peace. So I think that kind of answers your question right there. I think almost ironically, or counterintuitively maybe, the advent and the public launch of this Board of Peace and the roster of countries that have like jumped to be on Donald Trump's good side to join it has perhaps counterintuitively led to increased attention and increased investment in the United Nations itself. You have countries like France or Canada, middle power countries around the world that sort of see this as potentially being a competitor to the United Nations. And so they want to reinvest more heavily in the UN itself. They don't want to give up any sort of power that the UN might have today for this new entity.
So let's talk a little bit about that. The United Nations is in, according to Antonio Gutierrez, the UN Secretary General, in dire financial straits. Does this have anything to do with the Trump administration rolling out this sort of Potemkin board, or is it unrelated?
So I wouldn't say it's unrelated, but financial and liquidity crisis that the United Nations finds itself in today is not a consequence of the Board of Peace. It's a consequence of Donald Trump not paying America's membership dues to the United Nations. So the UN, there are 198 members or 192 members of the United Nations, and every 2 years, countries get together to decide on the budget for the organization and also to negotiate what's called a scales of assessment. Basically, what each country must pay as dues payments to the United Nations. And that scale is broadly a consequence of the country's relative, economic weight, basically relative to the size of its GDP. So the United States has historically been the largest single funder of the United Nations, contributing about 20% of its regular budget every 2 years. However, in 2025, Donald Trump paid $0 to the regular UN budget and only a small amount to the UN peacekeeping budget, which is assessed separately. And this sort of non-payment in 2025 comes after a year prior of an underpayment. So the US is in arrears to the tune of $2.2 billion to the UN. And keep in mind, its regular budget is $3.4 billion. So we're not talking about huge budgets in government terms. But the consequence of the late American payment and the non-American payment, combined with other countries not paying what they are assessed, has placed the UN in this really dire financial crisis. And this comes, again, not to get too in the weeds, after a couple years of liquidity crises as well. So the UN has already burned through its cash reserved, has already kind of moved money from one account to another account to avoid having to shut down.
Right.
But
Right.
in the coming months, the UN might simply just run out of money. So
Okay.
yeah.
So that seems like a pretty big deal. What are a few of the first or second order consequences of that?
I mean, big picture, the UN is going to do less with less. I've been covering the UN as a journalist for about 20 years now. And, governments around the world expect a lot of the United Nations. They expect it to respond in times of man made or natural disasters and crises. They expect it to deploy peacekeepers to hotspots around the world to keep a lid on conflicts before they spiral out of control. They expect it to use good offices to negotiate peace around the world. They expect it to support development initiatives around the world to, create new markets for wealthier countries and build up and fight, doing things like fight extreme poverty and fight infectious diseases. They, as governments, have given the United Nations tons and tons of what are called mandates in the UN system to do a lot of different things. And they've layered mandates upon mandates upon mandates, while at the same time not funding the UN in levels commensurate with what is expected to be done. But now that's been kind of the general trend over the last 20 years. That's kind of been the MO. But now, the UN still has all these mandates to do all this stuff around the world, but governments still expect them to do it, but they're not paying them to do it. And so there is going to be, I think, a crisis both of confidence, but also just of morale and ability of the UN to do what's entrusted to it around the world. And we're going to have to expect less of the UN in the coming years unless governments pony up and pay their dues on time and in full.
Are there any particular global hotspots where this would be particularly severe?
Yeah, I mean, so right now, the most recent episode I did of my Global Dispatches podcast was about the onset of civil war in South Sudan. South Sudan had a terrible civil war from 2011 to 2013 to 2018. There is a large UN peacekeeping presence in South Sudan that in the first civil war was unable to stop the war, but did serve as a point of civilian protection for hundreds of thousands of civilians who fled in the context of fighting to UN bases and found a modicum of safety there. UN, there are still like about 10,000 UN peacekeepers in South Sudan right now. War has just returned to South Sudan over the last couple of weeks. Will these peacekeepers be able to once again protect civilians who flee to their compounds? Will they have like the ammunition? Will they have the ability to fly helicopters at night to do patrols? Like, we don't know. These things are resource intensive, and those troop contributing countries that expect to be paid by the UN peacekeeping system to support their troops, they're not getting paid right now. Troops,
Right now as we speak.
yes, yeah,
Okay.
I don't know about South Sudan in particular, but I know that there's been a pause on, not to get too like in the weeds about the UN budget, but essentially um, the troops that provide blue helmets generally come from less developed countries, and they're reimbursed on a per troop per month basis for their deployment to UN peacekeeping missions by the UN peacekeeping budget in general. And those reimbursements are not coming in on time right now. So there's everything is kind of hanging on by a thread as we speak.
I see, and that would be obviously really serious for South Sudan. I mean, Sudan's in the middle of a civil war, which has gotten not a lot of international coverage, but I know that you've covered a lot on
Yeah.
your podcast and in your newsletter.
Yeah, I mean, the civil war in South Sudan that just reignited is a direct consequence of the enduring civil war in Sudan proper. It's partly a result of it spilling over the border to South Sudan, partly a consequence of the fact that South Sudan is entirely dependent on oil revenues. South Sudan like has the oil. It doesn't have the pipeline or the ability to export the oil. That has to go through Sudan. But oil revenues have dropped like 75% since the start of the civil war in the north because South Sudan is unable to export most of their oil through, war zones in Sudan itself. That's caused like big political pressures in South Sudan, which is one of the reasons civil war has erupted.
And a humanitarian crisis, I imagine.
Yeah, and on top of this, you have layered crisis upon crisis is the UN's humanitarian system, which to me is like the best thing the UN does. The UN over the last, at least since I've been covering the UN over the last 20 years, has gotten like very good at getting life-saving aid to some of the hardest places in the world at scale and quickly. The UN humanitarian system is like really like the best thing the UN does these days. It can go to like conflict zones, it can get to, places in natural disaster, but it's always relied on the funding of wealthier countries to do its job. When these efforts are well funded, the UN humanitarian response snaps into action really well and really effectively. When it's not funded, it can't. Now, I know we've talked a lot about UN funding, but it's important, I think, for viewers and listeners to understand that, like, the UN regular budget, which the US has not paid into this year, is considered separate from humanitarian activities. Humanitarian activities that are done by groups like the World Food Program or UNICEF, these are essentially funded like charities, where these entities, the World Food Program, goes to donor governments hat in hand asking for money to pay for a specific response. It's not like a membership club like the UN itself, so there's no dues payments. It's essentially like charitable contributions that these humanitarian agencies rely on. Typically, before January 21st of last year, when Donald Trump signed an executive order to basically cut all US foreign aid, the United States was responsible for about 40% of every dollar of global humanitarian relief. Now it spends virtually nothing on humanitarian relief. So these
Wow.
humanitarian agencies are under extreme pressure right now as well, separate from all of like the political things that are happening at the Security Council. these humanitarian agencies, the World Food Program, the UN Refugee Agency, UNICEF, are struggling mightily under massive cuts from the United States. Now, at the end of last year, the US did agree to potentially give $2 billion to the UN humanitarian system, but under very, I think, like tight conditions. And we haven't quite seen the outcome of that yet.
The outcome in that the money is not out the door yet, or the that
It's unclear if the money is out the door yet. And it's unclear the circumstances in which the US would approve the release of this $2 billion. But there was this MOU signed between the top UN humanitarian official, a guy who runs the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and the Trump administration. But but this was for like a $2.2 billion release of humanitarian funds compared to like the
Mhm.
$17 billion that the US supported last year. So
Right,
so it's
right.
it's it's a fraction of what it used to be if it actually
It's
gets
yeah,
funded.
it's a drop in the bucket if it
Mhm.
actually,
But at
gets
this
out.
point, like, the UN humanitarian agencies could use every drop in the bucket right now. They are running on fumes. So
Absolutely.
this is like, most people who work in like the humanitarian space see this kind of limited US support as a win. Um,
Yeah.
just because these humanitarian entities might be getting like something which is better than nothing.
I'm curious, I wanna ask kind of like a broader question about the United Nations that I've been thinking about, particularly since, Russia invaded Ukraine or launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. We have, Trump's threats over Greenland. We had the Venezuela operation. We have China threatening Taiwan. Um, these are all challenges to the United Nations in terms of, protecting sovereignty of countries that are clearly unlawful under the UN Charter. Um, how can the UN sort of remain relevant?
Yeah. I would add to your list also the Gaza conflict, which,
Absolutely.
like Russia's invasion of Ukraine, like, China's, ambitions in the South China Sea, kind of were an example of the fraying of that international order and the rules-based world order for most of the world. It didn't kind of get that same treatment, I think, in like the Western press, but for most of the world, they would see these like images of Gazans being slaughtered, of Gazans being starved deliberately by the Israeli government, and it would suggest to them basically what Mark Carney said, that like the rules-based world order is a fiction. And it's it's a fiction that is no longer seemingly sustainable. The big question is like what comes next for the UN. And here, my biggest kind of like concern, and one that I've talked about on my To Save Us from Hell podcast about the UN, is that you have like the a United States government whose foreign policy is seemingly premised on like pre-UN ideals around imperial domination in the case of Venezuela, pure like,
Take the oil.
take the oil, or territorial
Yeah.
expansion in the case of Greenland. Basically, the Trump administration is not even paying like lip service to liberal values or the rules-based world order, and can like a United Nations that exists to uphold and sustain that rules-based world order exist side by side with an American government that is indifferent to those rules-based world order. And it's those two, I think, big forces that are going to clash increasingly over the coming years. And it's hard for me to understand and know whether the two can coexist side by side or if something's got to give. That's the big story, the big picture story that I'll be following over the next like year or two.
So would you envision like how do you envision this crack up happening? I'm trying to sort of picture it.
I mean, like, the Board of Peace is one example of it. But
Right,
this, I think the Board of Peace is just kind of a, you know, half-cooked idea, that
right,
I think is not going to result into much. But what is causing material damage to the United Nations right now is the lack of American funding for it. The lack of America being $2.2 billion in arrears and the UN, having to do, basically having to shut down operations, in coming months if they don't get an injection of cash. So that's really what's kind of destroying and harming the UN. It's not like the idea of international cooperation, it's the mechanics of international cooperation that the United Nations enables and frankly makes like less costly. The one thing about the UN is that it reduces the transaction costs of international diplomacy. You have have translators already there. You have forums and
right.
procedures for negotiating things like treaties or agreements, and it makes just multilateralism, international diplomacy like much easier. Without the UN, everything's going to get, much harder.
Right, and the Trump administration has deployed a really, personalistic style of negotiation. It sent, Steve Witkoff, a former real estate developer and Trump's former golf partner, and Jared Kushner, who has no formal role in the US government. He's simply the president's son-in-law, have been going to Moscow and Berlin, and other European capitals to for this Ukraine uh, peace process.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at like the UN through Trump's like personal preferences, which I think are very important, as you said, everything is like personal to Trump. What's intriguing to me is that he kind of like likes the UN. He said so over and over, and he thinks the UN has like great potential, that maybe sometimes it doesn't live up to its potential. He also seems to
Because it has,
like
like,
the
a lot of grandeur to it
yeah, I
or,
think,
like
there's formality around,
yeah,
say, the UN General Assembly each year.
yeah,
And at the United Nations, the American president, no matter who he is first among equals. He is like president of the host country. He gets
right.
treated and feted with more grandeur than anyone else. And by all accounts, Trump seems to really like being fawned over, which like the UN General Assembly provides him that opportunity.
Okay. So just to wind down, is there anything you're gonna be watching, on your podcast or in your newsletter in the coming weeks and months about the UN or other sort of undercovered global hotspots?
Yeah, I mean, the big story in 2026 for the UN, other than its impending demise, is the selection of a new UN Secretary General. That Antonio Guterres is in his last year of his second term, and the race to replace Antonio Guterres kind of kicks off in earnest, really like this month. And by the end of the year, a new Secretary General will have been selected. Uh, by all accounts, by most accounts, the next Secretary General will probably be from Latin America. There is like an informal understanding around the UN that the position of the Secretary General kind of rotates between the geographic regions of the world, and it's Latin America's turn right now. We've seen, as of this morning, the breaking news is there's two formal candidates. The first is the current head of the IAEA, the Argentine diplomat Rafael Grossi. The second, announced this morning, is Michelle Bachelet, the former president of Chile, former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and former head of UN Women, who has been endorsed also by Brazil. So those are the two formally declared candidates as of now. But over the course of the next few weeks, I think we'll expect several more candidates to be released.
Okay, well, Mark, thank you so much for joining me and discussing this, very important issue,
Thanks. And if you're happen to have come across this because you're a subscriber of mine, definitely subscribe to Luke's Public Sphere. It's great.
and vice versa.
All right.
Alright,
Thanks.
take care. Bye.
Yeah. Bye.